I wanted to get into this aspect of conspiracies because conspiracy is actually something that I've purposely stayed away from on the show, in terms of like not talking about, not having people who like to talk about conspiracies on. I mean, I haven't really like selected them out or anything. It's just that I haven't um, taken the time to use this platform as an opportunity to talk about conspiracies. And so I'm actually very interested in your take on the proliferation of conspiracies. It sounded to me like this, the ubiquitousness of the hermeneutics of suspicion that you're talking about, uh, is something like the discovery of the unconscious, right? Or the discovery that of irrationality. And you see this sort of in like the post-rationalist communities. People like Robin Hanson talk a lot about how humans aren't really that rational and so forth. And so I feel like the move from modernism into postmodernism is sort of a confrontation with this fact of life that we're not quite as rational as we thought we were, and in fact a lot of the ways in which we act are unclear or even unknown to us, and we only sort of discover them after the fact, or you could even argue we don't even discover them eventually. We sort of just rationalize after the fact. But either way, it's this sort of feeling like we really lost our grounding in being able to make sense of the world, and even to perceive it at its most basic level, to perceive reality as it is. Now, I would argue that I think there are a lot of like physicists and mathematicians who would say, well, of course we don't really see reality for what it actually is. We have these evolved structures that are designed to see reality, to point us towards certain qualities of the environment, we have a certain orientation, and because we came out of a particular niche, we're sort of, our perceptual structures themselves are adapted to this particular niche. But how do you think about like the proliferation of conspiracy? I saw a video with Jordan Greenhall a few days ago where he was talking about this exact subject, conspiracy, and he pointed out very rightly that, well, a surprise birthday party is a conspiracy, right? Like something as innocuous as that is actually a conspiracy. You're getting together as a group of people and you're planning something out in secret, and other people or maybe no one else knows about it until it actually comes to fruition. And so one of the things that I find really interesting is that there's this whole war on conspiracy theories right now. The United States, since the Capitol attacks, has now declared a war on domestic terrorism, which is part of like the war on misinformation, or the war on conspiracy theories. And I'm expecting this kind of environment to increasingly intensify over the next decade. I don't really know how it's all going to play out, and I'm not going to speculate. But how do you think about conspiracy? Do you think of it as like a serious threat? Are there particular conspiracies that you think are overly problematic? And how do you think about the institutional response by the powers that be to this sort of ubiquitous conspiracy thinking?
So a couple of things I'm influenced by in my thinking on this. One would be Jesse Walker's United States of Paranoia, which is a really excellent book. The best one, I would say, about the sort of history of conspiracy theory in the United States. And one of the points he makes is that if you look just honestly at what we might call conspiratorial thinking, which would, be, imagining a surprise birthday party, but, on some kind of grand scale, the way that it has largely been represented and framed is that this is largely a kind of folk activity that takes place among, and, I would say even my account of it a little while ago sort of bought into this framing, that takes place among the sort of uneducated, people who don't have access to the right sort of theory. Mm-hmm. And Jesse Walker basically shows systematically throughout U.S. history that there is always a sort of equal and opposite realm of conspiratorial thinking that is precisely as conspiratorial as, for example, what the U.S. government is now identifying as so dangerous, that takes place among the governing elites, right? That the governing elites themselves are always as paranoid as the people they're trying to regulate, control, and ensure that they don't get too unruly. Mm. And so he goes back really to colonial America, right, and shows that there's I mean, you can go all the way back to, say, witch hunts and things like that, but which were orchestrated by elites, right? They were orchestrated by the governing elites of the colonies. So, but he shows this throughout history, right? And then an interesting twist is that concern about conspiracy theory, if you look at it, how it emerges mid-century, with liberals being worried about the John Birch Society and things like that, basically is itself often conspiratorial, right? That if you look at how the people, like the most famous kind of text from this period is Hofstadter's Paranoid Style in American Politics. So the interesting thing about it is that it talks about these sort of dangerous right-wing groups the same way that the dangerous right-wing groups are talking about communists, right? So there's this strange process by which not only is elite paranoia and sort of conspiratorial thinking just as dominant and often more powerful of a force, it's also often precisely in response to what is being identified as conspiracy theory that such thinking emerges. So, what I always say about this, and I it's kind of been my refrain in recent years, is, the real agents of misinformation today are the mainstream media, right? Mm-hmm. So, right. The most influential things that we could identify as clearly untrue narratives that had a huge influence were coming from the top, right? They were not disseminating from the bottom. So as long as we don't recognize that, as long as we refuse to acknowledge that aspect of it, that we're not going to have a clear sense of what's going on, right? And I do think that the reasons for that are parallel, and they all have to do with the way that the information economy has evolved, and essentially the way that a sort of surfeit of information and proliferation of different narratives has increased the demand for what we might call strong signals, right? And so the one of the things that sort of conspiratorial narratives do is they offer a strong signal, right? That in some way manages to stand out, and that in some way, takes advantage of or simply, broadcasts directly to certain narrative expectations that we have that have to do with a desire to find some kind of locus of agency, right? As an explanatory, as a means of explanation. Mm-hmm. And so I would say the proliferation of sort of top-down misinformation and the proliferation of sort of bottom-up misinformation they're the same phenomenon, right? They're both responses to this
wacky feedback loop too.
Yeah,
where they're
exactly.
Sort of feeding off each other.
Exactly. Yeah, and so those aren't separable, right? They're the same. They're the same thing. Mm-hmm. And I would also, the other thing that influences me here is thinking about actual literal paranoid schizophrenia.
Okay, sure. Let's get into that.
And the way that it, so one way that you can think about it, paranoia, and Freud already, in his, in some ways questionable sort of theory of paranoia, he does have some great insights. One of which is that paranoia is as he argues is actually the attempt to sort of repair the world rather than, the paranoia is a kind of improvised cure. So the schizophrenic evolves a paranoid narrative in order to explain what has already happened to him. And what has happened to him is a total fragmentation of the world into this kind of, nonsensical and traumatic kind of wellspring of just constant noise and overstimulation, where even just the most trivial, things, just objects, experiences are sort of impregnated with some kind of apparent meaning, but they don't know what it, but he doesn't know what it is. And so the part of the trauma of the sort of schizophrenic phenomenology is that you're inundated in this world of where almost everything is signal, right? That where you can't relegate noise to the background. It's all the noise has become signal, but it's a sort of enigmatic signal. And so the idea there is that the paranoid worldview that evolves is an attempt to kind of repair that utterly shattered universe, right, where meaning has kind of been lost precisely by, because there's a kind of surfeit of meaning in a sense. Mm-hmm. And so, so the idea is basically that paranoia is a kind of ad hoc attempt at reconstructing a sort of organizing narrative for a world that has been a sort of symbolic world that has been shattered, right, and left in ruins. So, I mean, I think that, roughly speaking, you can kind of apply that mediatically to what happens when you just have again, this situation of sort of information surfeit or information overload, right? That it has that schizophrenizing effect on everyone who partakes of it, right? And so it creates the conditions by which this kind of demand for these ad hoc narratives that in some way try to reconstruct something that would make sense, and that would sort of organize the world in hierarchical terms and kind of assign agency in certain places and relegate other things to the background. I mean, that's sort of how I would think about it roughly.